Mobility for us, especially in the ViPR world with our ViPR hats on, is becoming more and more important for us because if we can mobilize the individually effectively under the control of the structure of the body, the connective tissue elements, the neurological elements, the muscular elements, if we can control range of motion to an end range, whatever that end range may be, and mobilize the body, what we may be doing is providing positional stability, so out to my end range, wherever that is, a neurological control of that end range, and then a tissue accessibility to get there. In other words, the tissues, like you said, if my limitation, for instance, is the fascial structures, they need to give for me to go to my end range. So that's a progressive process that may happen over time. But gaining extra mobility is actually going to foster greater strength because then we can load the appropriate tissues. And you said this before, loading the appropriate tissues so they can actually store their requisite potential energy in them so that they can deliver an outcome, an unload, that is forceful and efficient. So can I pick on a couple of your athletes, not in particular, but let's say as a subject group or a position specific. Chuck, go ahead.
Now, before you go down that, and don't lose your thought, the thing that, and I'm not trying to make this into an infomercial, but one of the beauties of the ViPR.
Yeah, go for it, buddy. Infomercial away, man.
ViPR is that you can regress it and just use it, for instance, in the tilt series, when you just use it to slightly load the system, and you can emphasize one or all three planes of motion, even though when you work through one, you're affecting all three, but you have a predominance of one, and just a change of that angle of the ViPR or just a change of angle of the body is going to impact on other planes of motion, and then you can progress it to where it becomes a very dynamic tool. Now, with that being said, though, Michol, I don't want people to think through this discussion that the ViPR is replacing the traditional lifts or replacing free weights.
Yeah.
It's a complement that will enhance what the overall goal is in that specific goal.
And that's what we tell our master trainers. ViPR is not a tool that should replace anything else. It should sit as an adjunct to a well-balanced program, and it was designed specifically for that. We don't want to discount the merits of what we use in the industry because there is a certain adaptation and physiological change that is served using a bunch of complementary implements. And at the end of the day, what we want to do is make sure that we're getting the best adaptations for our athletes as we can. I would love to know this, Chucky. When you deal with, I'm going to pick on pitchers for a second, and you deal with amateur, it's a college level, you deal with minor leaguers, you deal with major leaguers when it comes to pitchers. If we think about the ability to throw a ball, and let's just talk about hard for a second before we have the finesse pitches, which in and of itself have different movement abilities with them, to generate more velocity on the ball. I would very much think it's not necessarily the strongest gym athletes that necessarily are the strongest throwers of the ball, because that would be insensitive to all of the nuances that go into the skill that's necessary to throw a fastball fast. Right? And I would just love to get your view, because you're talking to a guy who is a terrible athlete right here, that my daughter, who's 21 months old, could throw a ball better than me, probably. And she throws it backwards for some reason, which is crazy. But in your experience, dealing with the people at the highest level, mobility is important. Timing is important. Stability and positional strength is important. Force generation, exertion of power is important. Give us some of the things that you see as limitations, and juxtapose that against some of the things that you've seen that you've gone back and go, wow, that is an athlete that can generate a massive degree of outcome. And outcome for this discussion, let's say, is a fastball.
Well, here's what's interesting is that you're right. It is strictly not a muscle. In fact, throwing is not a muscle-generated activity. What I mean by that, you don't want to try and use brute force or brute strength to throw. If it was strictly a strength issue, I mean, some of the strongest athletes that we know are strongman competitions or even bodybuilders.
Yeah, sure. And I got a story about that, and I'll tell you in a second after you finish.
And And some of the worst throwers I've ever seen are gals who have that amount of muscle mass, but don't have the ability to harness it. This thing that took place through the era in the late 90s and early 2000s of baseball through the steroid era. I'm not saying good, bad, or indifferent with steroids. I mean, I'm not in favor of them to gain that advantage. I'd rather have an athlete who's going to work hard. But if every steroid user, or if steroids produce that kind of results in baseball, every steroid user would be able to hit a ball, 450 feet.
Right.
Guess not many of them can hit the ball past 200 feet.
Right.
When we go back to your question of throwing a baseball, I use the analogy of the arm as a whip.
Yeah.
And in order to get a good, strong whip, with a good snap of that whip, you've got to have a good grip, right?
Mm-hmm.
Grip on the handle. And then you need to be able to get this load and unload and then reload again to get that snap. Well, I tell pitchers or throwers, it's just pitchers, it's any thrower. It could be quarterbacks, it could be racquetball players, tennis players, even golfers, or position players in baseball. The arm is attached to the torso.
I typically throw my golf ball when I golf. Is that a good thing?
Well, for you it is a good thing.
Probably is, actually.
Golf club. But I tell them the arm's attached to the torso and goes for the ride.
Yeah.
The thing about pitching, it is anything but a sagittal plane movement. You have to be strong in the transverse and frontal planes, because if I can get up here for a minute, Michol, I mean, if you can see, over the system, you're going through rotation. And when you go through rotation, and let me go back, and then as you get into position, now you have to be strong and stable in the frontal plane. We're looking at this separation. Well, what is sagittal here? I may move through the sagittal plane for a moment, but everything is through the frontal and transverse plane.
Mm-hmm.
Now, where I see a lot of energy leaks, if you have the foot on the rubber for a pitcher, here, in fact, I'm going to use my shoe. I see as the pitcher loads up, they do this a lot.
Right.
Which is externally rotating the lower extremity and the hip, and then that's going to throw off timing.
Because they can't wind the tissues tighter, right, in the transverse plane.
I'm sorry, say that again?
Because they can't wind the tissues tight at that point. They can't access the tissues.
Well, they can access the tissues, but the question is, are they accessing it to their maximal capability?
Right.
Because we want to be able to wind them up and get extensibility. We want to get that elasticity. We want to get that eccentric load. But when that foot rolls out, you've lost that ability to load the glute, because the glute is going to be dependent upon what goes on at the foot and the lower extremity. So in this case, as I do this, I want to have the glute be able to load, look at it from the side, load eccentrically this way.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, you can even see my stripe here. I'm going to let the foot roll out a minute, and you see what's happening to the hip.
Yep.
So now that's a huge energy leak that now the athlete has in his mind or her mind. I still want to throw hard. So I've lost it in the hip, which is then going to lose it from the opposite hip to the opposite shoulder because timing is off. I'm going to now make up the difference by throwing harder with my arm.
Now, and you also compound that with less ground reaction push, because, as you said, if you're rolling to the outside, you can't push against the ground anymore.
That's huge, because, again, if the foot rolls out, what you're going to need to do is then generate the force of the first ray, or let's just call it the first metatarsal head into the first ray, to be able to load, which is going to create this internal rotation of the lower extremity into the hip, which will then explode towards home plate.
Yeah.
If you lost this, you don't have the stability now. It's just like doing a squat. If you have the feet roll out, the lower extremity loads rolls out, externally rotates, and the glute is actually, the fibers of the glute become shorter.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not, during the loading phase, they're not optimally loaded.
Yeah.
But let me go back to the throwing. So now I've got this rotation going on. I've got to generate that force from the foot into the hip,
mm-hmm.
to the thoracic spine. And when I do that, when you're able to eccentrically load and control it and then come over the top, you're just going to see this graceful fluidity of movement that has very little stress on the shoulder, very little stress on the elbow, mm-hmm. when the rhythm and the timing is done properly.
Yeah. And I suppose, to be honest and to be fair, rhythm and timing is only going to be trained by doing that which it is that you're wanting to accomplish. I mean, taking, for instance, a ViPR and, trying to get into those positions, thinking that you're going to depolarize and repolarize the muscular system to the same degree as actually throwing a baseball, wouldn't happen. The neural sequence is going to be different. But what we might say is to get a ViPR, let's say, to get you into those positions, will put load and stress and excess, and you would access the mobility necessary to get your tissues to load in that capacity so that they can go through the requisite joint motions in the specific angles to then be able to foster strength in that position, that then you could actually compound and say, now I'm going to add speed to that positional stability because now my body is at the right place at the right time, and now I can just add a element and component of speed to it.
And what's interesting about using the ViPRs, because I do use them with pitchers quite a bit, is I need to be able to load them from here, so I make a diagonal pattern, possibly with a drop step or externally rotating of both hips, with the ViPR in an externally rotated, or my grips being an offset grips.
Yep.
That's loading here, but now what happens when I follow through?
Right, sure.
I have to make sure that my, what I call the posterior X factor of the opposite glute and the opposite lat that go through the lumbar fascia have to be loaded properly, because you are generating force through the shoulder as it rotates with a fastball, and if I recall, 2,000 degrees per second.
Sure, I've heard that before too.
Are loading your system, and keep in mind, you've got a pitcher that's striding towards home plate, and essentially it's like doing a lunge. And it's doing a lunge with the weight of an arm, and what's the weight of the arm? 12, 15 pounds coming into the system. That's loading at about 6, 7 times their body weight.
Yeah.
You've got the lower extremity, the glute, and the opposite lat being able to be mobile enough to eccentrically load to reduce the risk of injury to the shoulder and the elbow. And
Chucky, can I ask you a favor? Can you stand up again and get into that pitching position? Because what we would look at is your right shoulder, the anatomy through the right anterior shoulder structure, so the pec major and minor, going through and you often talk about, and I like the way you phrase this, the opposite adductor in the opposite hip. So you're thinking about, let's say, the relationship between the right shoulder and the left hip. You're loading the anterior shoulder girdle, the abdominal wall, right down to the adductors on the opposite side. And what we would say is if you load that all together, that becomes a powerful longitudinal map of connective tissue and muscle that can accentuate the whip action.
Well, Michol, this is all connected by fascia. You know better than anybody. This is all connected by fascia, but you're going from the shoulder into the pec, into the serratus, into the oblique, into the opposite oblique, into the hip flexor adductor. We know adductor comes down, connects right at the medial aspect of the knee. That's right next to the hamstring. That's right next to the calf group. And now as I rotate, but before I even go this way, but from the pec we go into the delt. You better have some lengthen and you better have long and strong bicep. Mm-hmm. Because as you follow through, and I'll look at it this way, as you follow through and reach towards home plate, what's it doing to the bicep?
Sure.
It's eccentrically loaded. As I come back here, this bicep is an extension to what goes out the shoulder of the pec. This bicep is connected to this adductor.